December 1944, Northern France. 37 American soldiers receive an order to hold a hill that doesn't exist. Cut off. Outnumbered 9-1. Erased by their own command. For 2 days, they fought an army and then vanished from history. This is the story the war tried to forget, the Forgotten Platoon. Northern France lay buried beneath a white stillness that hid the scars of war. The winter of 1944 had turned the fields into a frozen wasteland of silence, broken only by the low groan of distant artillery. The Allied advance had slowed to a crawl. Lines of communication, stretched and tangled, had become brittle under the strain of weather, exhaustion, and human error. Somewhere beyond the fog and fractured radio chatter, men waited for orders that would never reach them. Lieutenant Cole Morgan stood in the snow, staring at a map that no longer made sense. The ink had bled in the cold drizzle, the coordinates blurred into meaningless numbers. He was 28, with the sharp discipline of a career soldier and the quiet fatigue of a man who had seen too many mistakes disguised as strategy. His platoon, 37 men drawn from a mix of regular infantry and a segregated support unit, had been told to hold a hill marked 306 on the map. The word temporary had been used. Temporary, Morgan thought, was a dangerous promise. The climb to Hill 306 had been slow and silent. The landscape seemed to resist their movement, as though the ground itself wanted them gone. Their boots crunched on ice-covered soil, their breath rising in faint white clouds. There was no warmth, no sound of engines, no comfort of connection to the rest of the line. The fog rolled like a living thing, swallowing visibility and erasing direction. The radios crackled with static, the words of command swallowed before they reached an ear that could act. The platoon was an experiment of sorts, a combination that had never been meant to exist. Black and white soldiers, thrown together not by choice but by the administrative confusion of battle. The Army still drew its lines sharply in 1944, but chaos blurred them here. Sergeant David Booker, a tall African-American mechanic turned infantryman, had never expected to find himself sharing command responsibilities with men who looked at him with a mixture of respect and uncertainty. Private Harold Kim, the son of Korean immigrants, marched in silence beside them, unsure which army would claim his loyalty in history's memory. They reached the hill near dusk. It was less a hill than a rise of earth, overlooking nothing of importance, certainly not a strategic point worth holding. Morgan unfolded his map again, squinting against the wind, trying to match terrain to symbols. Nothing fit. The tree line was wrong, the slope inverted. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear faint gunfire, but it seemed too far, too random. Either the enemy had moved, or they had. The coordinates, he suspected, were off by miles. Still, an order was an order. The men dug in, scraping at the frozen ground with shovels that clanged against the frost. They built makeshift shelters, their breath turning to mist as they worked. The wind whistled through branches, carrying with it a sense of abandonment. There was no supply line, no contact from command. Their rations were half frozen, their ammunition low. Yet Morgan kept them moving, his discipline holding the fragile line between confusion and collapse. Night fell hard over the hill. The fog thickened, turning every shadow into a shape of threat. Morgan paced between the positions, counting heads, offering quiet nods where reassurance might have been expected. He knew what they all knew. They had been forgotten. The war had many fronts, and mistakes were easier to bury than to fix. Minority platoons, especially those cobbled together without clear oversight, were often assigned to temporary defenses, positions meant to absorb the chaos until someone could draw a cleaner line on a better map. In the dark, the men's thoughts drifted. Some prayed, others stared into the fog, thinking of warmth, of home, of the strange irony of fighting for a country that could not yet see them as equals. Booker sat by his rifle, tracing the initials carved into the stock, not out of sentiment, but to remind himself that he existed beyond this hill. Kim, quiet and watchful, Took notes in a small field, journal coordinates, names, sketches of terrain that didn't match the official maps. Morgan didn't ask what he wrote. Maybe he wanted someone to remember, even if command never did. By dawn, the snow had deepened. The fog began to thin, revealing a landscape of white hills and dead trees. There was still no word from headquarters. The radio operator twisted the dial until his fingers bled, catching fragments of coded transmissions that belonged to other units, other battles. Somewhere, the main front had shifted, and no one had told them. The enemy could be 10 miles away, or 2. Morgan gathered his men. He told them they would hold position until relief came. He didn't say what they all feared, that no relief was coming. He moved among them with quiet purpose, reinforcing defenses that faced no visible threat. The act of preparation was its own. Survival. To move was to believe that someone, somewhere, still knew they were there. By noon, the fog returned, thicker and heavier. Sound became distorted, direction meaningless. It was as if the world had folded around Hill 306, trapping them in a pocket of forgotten orders and frozen breath. The men moved slower, their eyes scanning a horizon that refused to reveal itself. Somewhere below, the distant rumble of tanks echoed, though it was impossible to tell whose. Morgan stood at the edge of the hill, staring into the void of gray. He thought of the map again, the smudged ink, the wrong coordinates, the meaningless order that had brought them here. History, he realized, was written by those who received the right orders. Those who didn't would vanish between the lines. And as the day faded into another colorless dusk, the truth settled like snow around them. They had been sent to hold ground that didn't exist, for a purpose no one remembered, in a war that would never record their names. The fog rolled back across the hill, swallowing the men, the trenches, the last traces of movement. Somewhere, far behind the lines, someone corrected a map, adjusted a coordinate, erased a number, and moved on. The orders vanished in the fog, and so would their names. The cold had a way of making men honest. On Hill 306, the cold stripped away rank, color, and pride, until all that was left were 37 figures breathing steam into the frozen air. The fog pressed down like a weight, muting the world to the crunch of boots and the distant echo of artillery too far away to help them. It was here, in the emptiness of that nameless hill, that the platoon became something more than a number on a lost report. Sergeant Henry Red Halley was the oldest of them, though only 35. A veteran of North Africa and Sicily, he carried the quiet weariness of a man who had seen orders change faster than the seasons. His nickname came from the shock of auburn hair beneath his helmet, now dulled by frost and dirt. Red didn't talk much, but when he did, the men listened. He had learned that leadership wasn't about barking commands. It was about being the one who never broke, even when everything else did. Corporal James Porter, the black radio operator, was his opposite in temperament, sharp, witty, and always searching for a signal. The Army called him Porter, but the men called him Static, because no matter how much noise filled the air, he always seemed to catch a whisper of something. Porter had joined the Signal Corps, hoping to fight through wires, not mud. Yet here he was, in a platoon that wasn't supposed to exist, his hands raw from the cold, coaxing life out of a battered radio that had more frost inside it than electricity. Private Samuel Doc Irving was the medic, though his hands had never been allowed near an officer's commission. In civilian life, he had nearly finished medical school before the war began. But regulations were clear: no black man would hold the title of doctor in uniform. So he patched wounds quietly, his knowledge far outstripping his rank. The men trusted him because he never raised his voice, never lost his calm. He carried a satchel of bandages and a collection of folded letters he never mailed, written to a country that still didn't see him as its own. Private Daniel Reese was the youngest, just 19, his uniform too big, and his rifle still too clean. He had come from Kansas, the son of a farmer who thought the war would make a man out of him. Reese had believed that too, until the first night on the hill. Now, he clung to every word from Halley and Porter like scripture, trying to mask his fear with routine. He didn't speak much, afraid that his voice might crack under the weight of it all. And then there was Technical Sergeant Frank O'Donnell, the platoon's engineer and its quiet backbone. O'Donnell had the face of a man carved from iron and the patience of a saint. To him, war was a problem to solve, bridges to repair, engines to fix, minds to disarm. Men were men, tools of the same purpose, and he never cared about color or creed. It wasn't idealism, it was survival. He saw through division the way a mechanic saw, through rust. The hill became their world. They built fires that never seemed to burn warm enough, huddled under torn tarps that flapped like ghost wings in the wind. The rations dwindled to scraps, the canned meat frozen solid, the coffee grounds stretched thin. Porter cursed at his radio daily, trying to pull a signal out of the static, while Hallie kept watch with eyes that had seen too much. In the mornings, Morgan would inspect the perimeter, walking through the thin mist that never lifted. The men would salute out of habit, though they all knew the formalities had long since lost their meaning. They were bound now by something more fragile and more enduring necessity. One afternoon, Haley found Reese struggling to light a small fire behind a mound of earth. The boy's hands shook too much from the cold. Without a word, Hallie knelt, cupped his gloved hands around the match, and shielded the flame until it caught. Reese looked up, surprised. Hallie just nodded and said, "Nothing." In that moment, the line between officer and recruit blurred into quiet humanity. Nearby, Porter was teaching Doc Irving how to adjust the radio's antenna, their laughter muffled by the wind. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. A black medic and a black operator, both denied advancement, now trying to make contact with a world that had already forgotten them. They shared a grin when the radio emitted a faint pulse of sound, then a sigh when it faded back into silence. O'Donnell spent his days reinforcing the dugouts, stacking sandbags that froze solid within hours. He moved like a man who understood that structure was sanity. The others followed his lead without question, sensing that even if command had abandoned them, O'Donnell's resolve would not. Trust, in that place, didn't come through words. It was built through shared cold, shared silence, and the knowledge that every man was enduring the same invisible burden. The divisions that had followed them, from training camps and transport ships, began to erode beneath the frost. They were not brothers yet, but they were no longer strangers. Each night, Morgan made his rounds, stopping by the fire pits, exchanging brief nods. The men didn't know what he thought, but they trusted the way he stood, the steadiness in his eyes, the refusal to yield to despair. He didn't offer speeches. He didn't promise rescue. He simply carried the map, the same one that had led them wrong, as though by holding it he could will their purpose back into existence. The hill remained silent. The fog refused to break. Time stretched thin, marked only by the dull ache of hunger and the sound of breath in the cold. Porter's radio whispered and died again, a faint echo of the world beyond their isolation. Then, one morning, as the men gathered for their weak coffee and counted their dwindling rations, the silence changed. It began as a faint vibration beneath the frozen ground, a pulse too steady to be wind or thunder. O'Donnell felt it first, setting down his cup and staring toward the forest below. The others followed his gaze. The sound grew deeper metal against earth, rhythmic and relentless. Porter adjusted the radio instinctively, though no transmission could have warned them of what was coming. From the forest below, a metallic rumble began to rise engines, hundreds of them. Leadership, Morgan had come to learn, was less about authority and more about endurance, the ability to carry other men's doubts, fears, and fates as if they were one's own. On Hill 306, that weight pressed heavier than the winter sky. The men looked to him, not for inspiration, but for proof that someone, anyone, still knew what to do. Yet even as he stood at the top of that frozen ridge, his eyes scanning the endless gray, he knew what command had really given him. Silence from above. The last message from headquarters had come 3 days ago, a curt transmission stripped of detail and humanity. Hold position until relieved. No reinforcement time, no enemy status, no supply schedule. Morgan had asked for clarification, his request met only with static. He could almost hear the disdain and the pauses between responses. the condescension from voices that knew the coordinates were wrong but refused to correct them. The platoon he commanded was expendable, a decoy meant to absorb an attack that might never come. And somewhere behind those words, unspoken yet understood, was the cruel subtext. If they failed, it would be forgotten, because they were not the kind of platoon command remembered. He sat inside the makeshift command tent, the wind tugging at the canvas seams, and unfolded the same battered map that had doomed them. The ink was still smudged, the paper brittle from moisture. The coordinates of Hill 306 were barely legible, and the surrounding terrain no longer matched reality. He could feel the tremor of distant artillery through the soles of his boots, far away but steady enough to remind him that the war was still moving, just not here. He rubbed his temples, tracing his finger along the ridge lines. The truth was simple and merciless. They had been planted in the wrong place. Someone up the chain, in the warmth of an office tent or the comfort of a staff car, had made an error one too minor to correct, too inconsequential to risk. Acknowledgement. So the order had stood. 37 men would hold a hill that did not matter, against an enemy that might never appear, all for the sake of preserving the illusion that the front was under control. Outside, the men worked in silence. Halley inspected the defensive line. O'Donnell checked the fuel reserves. Porter listened to the radio as if willpower alone might summon a voice. Morgan watched them through the opening in the tent, his chest tightening with a mixture of pride and dread. They didn't know what he knew, or maybe they did, but pretended otherwise. Command had chosen them not for their strength, but for their expendability. A mixed platoon under a junior officer was an administrative anomaly, easy to misplace, easier still to ignore. The prejudice that infected the Army's hierarchy didn't vanish at the front. It merely wore a different uniform. Morgan had seen it before. Assignments that made no tactical sense. Supplies delayed indefinitely. Orders that placed black and minority units in positions meant to draw enemy fire while others advanced elsewhere. He had been raised to follow orders without question, but every mile of frozen mud had eroded that obedience. Yet even knowing this, he refused to move. Duty, to him, was not blind obedience, it was defiance in the face of injustice. To abandon the hill now, even a meaningless one, would mean proving every prejudice correct. He would not let these men be written off as failures. If they were to vanish, they would do so standing. The fog thickened outside, rolling in like a tide. Morgan stepped into the cold, his breath clouding the air. He walked among the men, offering calm nods, asking brief questions. Porter met his gaze. The radio pressed to his ear. "Nothing, sir," he said quietly. "Not a whisper." Morgan nodded, hiding his frustration. It was always nothing. He returned to his tent and stared again at the map. Leadership, he thought, was supposed to come with certainty, the belief that decisions led somewhere meaningful. But here, it meant keeping faith alive in men who already knew they were forgotten. It meant pretending that orders carried purpose even when they didn't. Every man outside that tent needed him to believe, and so he did, because leadership was as much performance as conviction. The night deepened, the sky heavy with unfallen snow. Morgan lit a candle, the flame trembling in the draft. He opened his journal, a habit from before the war, and wrote brief notes about the men. Not strategy, not supply counts, just names and fragments. Halley steady, Porter still fighting for signal, Irving quiet strength, Reese scared, but learning. He wrote because he feared that if he didn't, their names would dissolve with the fog, erased by the same indifference that had sent them here. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it a low, rhythmic hum. He paused, listening. The sound was faint but distinct, mechanical, distant, and growing. He stepped to the flap of the tent and peered into the darkness. Nothing yet, but he knew the terrain could hide 1,000 threats. He closed the journal and slipped it into his coat. The weight of command pressed down again, familiar and suffocating. Every decision from here would mean risking lives, and every hesitation could cost the same. Leadership was not glory. It was loneliness, carried in silence. He thought of the officers behind him, men with cleaner uniforms, clearer orders, and colder hearts. Men who would never have to answer for what happened on Hill 306. Morgan took one last look at the map, its creases deep and worn. The ink blurred under his thumb. Somewhere beyond the forest, engines murmured like a promise. He didn't know whose they were, friendly or enemy, and it didn't matter. What mattered was that the men would look to him when the fog broke. He folded the map slowly, with the care of a man handling something sacred. The edges cracked where dampness had set in. He slid it into his coat pocket, a relic of both duty and defiance. If no one else would defend them, the map would have to do a symbol of order in a world unraveling. Morgan looked toward the dark horizon, his breath freezing midair. He could already feel the tremor of something vast moving beneath the silence. The engines grew louder, echoing through the trees like distant thunder. He straightened, his jaw set. Leadership, he thought, was the courage to stand even when the ground itself shifted beneath you. Morgan folded the map, knowing it would be their only line of defense. The night felt endless, suspended between dread and duty. The fog rolled over Hill 306 like a living shroud, thick and heavy, muffling every sound. Beneath it, the men of the platoon moved with quiet purpose, their shapes blurring into shadows against the pale snow. They worked without complaint, each motion deliberate, stacking sandbags, carving foxholes, reinforcing barriers with scavenged planks and twisted wire. The wind howled like a restless spirit, but they ignored it. There was a rhythm in their labor, the kind born not of confidence, but of necessity. Courage was not a feeling that came easily in the cold. It had to be built, one shovel of earth at a time. Sergeant Halley moved along the line, checking positions, his red hair dim beneath the muted glow of a covered lantern. He gave brief nods, offered a quiet word where needed, his presence a reminder that the work mattered, even if no one else believed it did. Private Reese followed close behind, learning through imitation, his young face drawn tight with the tension of someone trying to prove he belonged. His gloves were torn, his fingers numb, but he refused to stop digging. Corporal Porter hunched over the radio, its faint light illuminating his determined expression. The device hissed and popped, offering nothing but static. He kept the earpiece pressed tight, as if he could will a message into existence. Each burst of sound teased hope, a sign of life beyond the fog, only to fade again into nothing. The silence from command was more frightening than the thought of the enemy. It confirmed what they already suspected. They were on their own. Nearby, Doc Irving worked with quiet efficiency, organizing his supplies, preparing bandages and morphine for wounds that did not yet exist. His movements were calm, methodical, but there was an intensity behind his eyes, the awareness that when the time came, he would be the last comfort some of them would know. He had seen too many men die, for reasons that made no sense, and yet he still prepared, because that was courage in its purest form, doing what must be done when no one is watching. Technical Sergeant O'Donnell hammered a length of metal into place, reinforcing a barricade that leaned too much to the left. The sound rang out through the cold air, sharp and final, before he stepped back to inspect his work. To him, these barriers were not mere structures, they were statements, proof that the platoon still intended to hold. He had seen fear before, seen it hollow men from the inside, but here on Hill 306, he saw something different. The men weren't brave because they lacked fear. They were brave because they carried it quietly and kept working anyway. Morgan moved among them, his breath forming faint clouds that disappeared almost as soon as they left his mouth. He spoke little, his words measured and steady. He knew the value of composure. Panic was contagious, and so was resolve. He could feel the tension in the air. A taut line stretched between every heartbeat. His hands trembled when he thought no one was looking, but when he passed through the lines, they were steady. Leadership, he reminded himself, was as much performance as principle. As the hours dragged toward dawn, the temperature dropped even further. The fog thickened, swallowing the landscape until the world seemed to end a few feet beyond each man's trench. The only sounds were the scrape of shovels, the soft clink of metal, and the occasional muttered curse. Each man worked not just to survive, but to keep from thinking too long about what waited in the trees below. Reese paused for a moment, wiping his brow though the sweat had long since frozen. His shovel struck rock, sending a sharp vibration up his arm. He stared into the darkness, straining his ears. "Sir," he whispered, though no one answered. The silence pressed back like a living thing. He forced himself to dig again. The motion kept him from listening too closely. Hallie passed behind him, offering a brief clap on the shoulder, wordless reassurance. Porter muttered something about the radio being cursed, and O'Donnell grinned faintly without looking up. Even in exhaustion, they found small anchors of familiarity. These were not the bonds of soldiers chasing glory. They were the quiet, necessary ties of men who refused to break. Morgan stopped near the edge of the hill, peering through binoculars that revealed only fog. He knew the enemy was out there, the engines had confirmed it, but he couldn't yet see movement. That uncertainty was worse than contact. Waiting in the dark, preparing for something unseen, demanded a kind of courage that few understood. He thought of his men, their faces drawn and pale in the flickering lamplight, their eyes reflecting the strain of the moment. They deserved better than this, better orders, better leadership from above, better recognition. But all they had was him, and that had to be enough. The fog shifted briefly, revealing the outline of trees below black silhouettes against a lighter gray horizon. Morgan watched for a moment longer, then turned back toward the lines. "Keep the men ready," he told Hallie. "No one sleeps until sunrise." Hallie nodded, understanding that the order was less about vigilance and more about resolve. Sleep, after all, was dangerous. It made men think of peace. The platoon settled into uneasy silence. The fire pits had burned down to faint embers, glowing like scattered stars in the frost. Porter gave up on the radio at last, pulling his blanket tighter and staring into the void. Reese tried to eat, but couldn't swallow. Doc Irving checked his supplies once more, every gesture practiced, his calm the only thing that seemed to hold time together. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, its cry echoing through the emptiness. Then even that sound faded, leaving only the heartbeat rhythm of waiting. Sky began to change, the darkness lifting, not to light, but to a dull, metallic gray that painted everything in tones of steel and ash. Morgan stood alone at the crest of the hill, the wind biting at his face. He could feel dawn approaching, that fragile moment between night and day, when the world seemed to hold its breath. He thought again of what courage truly meant, not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand firm in its presence. Every man on this hill carried his own kind of fear, and yet not one had turned away. The silence became unbearable, the kind that made the imagination dangerous. Then, just as the first faint light broke through the fog, the air tore open with a sound that shattered thought itself. The first shell screamed through the fog. The first sound was not a scream or an explosion, it was the whistle of air being split apart, the deep tremor of earth waking in terror. The shell landed just beyond the southern trench, throwing up a geyser of frozen soil that rained down in chunks across the line. For an instant, there was no time to think, only to move. The men ducked instinctively, their breaths caught halfway between curses and prayers. A second shell followed, closer this time, shaking the ground beneath their boots. Lieutenant Morgan didn't flinch. He stood just behind the nearest barrier, scanning the fog for movement, counting seconds between impacts. Discipline was survival now. The Germans were probing the hill, not yet a full assault, but a test of resolve. The precision of their fire told him everything he needed to know. This was no random bombardment. They had the coordinates. Somehow, in this forgotten corner of France, the enemy knew exactly where to look. "Hold positions." Hallie's voice cut through the chaos, steady and sharp. The men responded as one, sliding into their foxholes, rifles aimed toward the unseen valley below. The fog glowed briefly orange as another shell burst farther down the slope. The blast muffled by snow. Shards of earth pattered across helmets like rain. For a moment, everything went still again, the silence more terrifying than the noise. Then came the engines. The deep, rolling thunder of mechanized advance treads grinding through mud and frost, synchronized, relentless. Porter crouched over his radio, twisting dials in desperation, his fingers bleeding from the cold. "Nothing," he hissed, slamming the casing once before catching himself. "They've jammed us." Morgan's jaw tightened. "Then we hold," he said simply. From the fog emerged shadows long, dark, shifting like ghosts. Figures moved behind the haze, the rhythmic flicker of muzzle flashes illuminating silhouettes of men and machines. The German assault began not with a shout, but with the mechanical precision of practiced destruction. Mortars arced through the air, their trails faintly visible in the dim morning light. Bullets snapped past in clean, controlled bursts. O'Donnell was already at the center line, shouting adjustments. 2 degrees left! Hold your fire until they break the ridge! His voice carried authority that no rank could bestow. The men obeyed. They waited, hearts pounding, breath fogging inside helmets, until the first shapes breached the fog. Then, as one, they opened fire. The sound tore through the stillness, sharp, rhythmic, purposeful. Their rifles barked in disciplined volleys, measured and exact. There was no panic, no wasted shots. Morgan had drilled them for this, not for glory, but for precision. The hill erupted in flashes of defiance, bursts of light against the dull gray dawn. German figures fell back into the mist, replaced by more, moving with cold efficiency. The platoon answered, every push with fire of their own, the line holding firm. Reese, trembling in his trench, fired until his clip emptied, his shoulder aching from the recoil. He reloaded with shaking hands, teeth clenched. Nearby, Doc Irving kept low, counting each burst, readying for the wounded who hadn't fallen yet. Porter had abandoned the radio now, picking up his rifle and joining the line without hesitation. He fired in short bursts, muttering under his breath, not curses, but rhythm, keeping himself steady. The ground around them churned with explosions, soil mixed with snow, turning to slush that clung to boots and faces. Splinters of wood and shrapnel sang through the air, slicing branches from the skeletal trees. The smell of oil and cordite filled the lungs, thick and bitter. Yet through it all, the men held. Morgan crouched behind a half-collapsed barrier, binoculars to his eyes, watching the enemy advance and recoil. The Germans were testing their defenses, sending squads up the slope under cover of fog, withdrawing when fire grew too heavy. He recognized the pattern, a calculated pressure meant to exhaust the defenders before the real attack began. He turned to Hallie. "They're probing," he said quietly. "The main force isn't here yet." Hallie nodded grimly, sweat freezing along his hairline. "Then we make them think we are." The next wave came harder, faster, automatic fire sweeping across the ridge, the sound of machine guns cutting through the wind. O'Donnell signaled for flanking fire, and the platoon adjusted with clockwork precision. Each man knew his sector, his angle, his purpose. They fought not as individuals, but as a single, breathing organism. Fear lived in them, but it no longer ruled them. Doc Irving moved through the trenches like a ghost, his satchel swinging at his side. He stopped to press a hand against a wounded man's shoulder, whispered something only the wind could hear, and moved on. Courage, Morgan thought, wasn't loud. It was steady. It was the refusal to let fear dictate motion. For nearly an hour, the exchange continued. Gunfire, silence, then gunfire again. The fog grew darker, the smoke mingling with mist until the world itself seemed to be burning from within. The Germans pulled back briefly, the mechanical growl of engines fading into the trees. The men did not cheer. They only breathed, the kind of deep, shuddering breaths that came when one realized he was still alive. Their faces were streaked with grime and frost, their eyes hollowed by disbelief. Reese sat against the wall of his trench, staring at his rifle like it was something foreign. Porter checked his ammunition, muttering counts beneath his breath. Hallie leaned against the barricade, his chest heaving, his expression unreadable. Morgan climbed the ridge and looked down through the smoke. The fog had swallowed the forest again, hiding the enemy's retreat or repositioning. He knew better than to think it was over. The Germans were methodical. They didn't quit after a single failed push. O'Donnell joined him, his voice low. "They'll be back," he said. Morgan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yes," he answered, his tone calm, resolute. "And so will we." The platoon began to reset, reloading weapons, patching defenses, gathering what little strength remained. The cold bit deeper now, mingling with exhaustion. Yet no one spoke of retreat. The hill had become something more than ground. It was defiance made tangible. As the fog thickened once more, swallowing sound and shape alike, an eerie quiet settled over Hill 306. The men listened, waiting, each heartbeat echoing in the stillness. For a fleeting moment, it almost felt like peace, brittle, deceptive peace. Then, faintly, from deep within the forest below, came a new sound, not the clatter of retreat, but the low, unified movement of something vast. The hill was quiet, but movement stirred again below. By mid-morning, the world was no longer gray, it was fire. The first shells of the renewed assault tore into the slope with ruthless precision, each one finding a new wound in the earth. The air shook with thunder, the ground convulsed, and the sky itself seemed to bleed. Hill 306 ceased to be a hill at all. It became a cratered wasteland, a landscape of mud, flame, and smoke where form and reason dissolved. The barrage was relentless. Every explosion blurred into the next, a chain of violence that stretched without pause. Men flattened themselves against the frozen soil, their helmets vibrating with each shockwave. The stench of gunpowder mixed with the metallic tang of frozen earth. Visibility dropped to nothing. Even the men, only a few feet apart, could barely see each other through the thick smoke. The fog that had once been their shield now trapped them in chaos. Morgan crouched behind a shattered barrier, his ears ringing so violently that sound had become vibration. His setter, Markin's, the messens, and please and never matter. Markin, teeth rattled with every concussion. He tried to call to Hallie, but his voice was swallowed by the roar. Fire leapt from shell bursts, licking the snow until it melted into black slush. Splinters of rock and debris rained down like metal hail. Private Daniel Reese was thrown backward by one of the blasts, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. He hit the ground hard, the world spinning. A jagged fragment of shrapnel had torn through his leg just below the knee. He tried to stand, but the limb gave out beneath him. For a moment, panic clawed at his chest, the cold, the pain, the noise, all merging into a single, overwhelming blur. Doc Irving appeared through the haze, crouching low, his face streaked with soot and frost. "Don't move," he said, his voice calm despite the hell around them. He tore open his satchel, his fingers working fast, even as the ground shook beneath them. His supplies were nearly gone, the morphine vials empty, the bandages blood-soaked, stiff. He tore a strip from his own sleeve, wrapping it tightly around Reese's leg, improvising a tourniquet with a broken belt buckle. Reese's teeth clenched as pain surged through him. He tried not to scream, knowing sound carried weakness. Irving didn't speak again, he just worked. His movements were practiced, confident. Courage, Morgan thought from a few yards away, wasn't the absence of fear. It was the act of doing what must be done when the world refused to stop breaking. O'Donnell and Haley moved between the craters, checking positions, rallying whoever could still fight. The trenches had collapsed in places, leaving only uneven pits. Fire from the German lines intensified, short bursts of machine gun fire sweeping across the hill like scythes. The men fired back in controlled volleys, their rifles glowing hot from constant use. Porter stayed by his radio, his body curled around it as if protecting a living thing. He twisted the dials through the smoke, adjusting frequency after frequency. Static screamed in his ears, sharp, cutting, like the shriek of metal under pressure. But then, through the white noise, something flickered. A voice faint, broken, but real. His pulse quickened. "Command. This is." The words dissolved again. Porter slammed his fist against the casing. "Come on. Talk to me." He adjusted the antenna, using a length of wire O'Donnell had scavenged earlier. The radio hissed, then crackled again. Fragments of sound bleeding through the interference. Hill 306. Hold. Position. And then nothing. Morgan heard it too. He looked up from his post, his eyes meeting Porter's through the drifting smoke. Neither spoke. They both knew the voice didn't matter. It was too late for reinforcements, too late for strategy. Still, the sound of it, the faint reminder that someone out there still recognized their existence, steadied them for a moment. The shelling continued. For what? Felt like hours, though the sun barely moved in the sky. Flames danced along the trenches, licking at the remnants of tarps and ammunition boxes. The snow had melted into pools of blackened mud, steam rising like breath from the ground itself. Every explosion threw up another spray of debris, showering the men with earth and ash. Reese drifted in and out of consciousness, his face pale beneath the grime. Doc Irving stayed beside him, shielding him from debris, murmuring quiet reassurances that neither could hear. His hands moved automatically, pressing cloth into wounds, checking pulses, rationing what little morphine remained among the worst of the injured. His eyes were calm, but the tremor in his jaw betrayed the exhaustion beneath. Hallie stumbled toward Morgan, his uniform torn, a smear of blood on his temple. "They're creeping forward again," he shouted over the din. "Infantry in the trees." Morgan nodded, his mind racing through possibilities that all ended the same. "Hold them at range," he replied. "No one fires blind." Hallie nodded and disappeared back into the smoke. Moments later, the crack of rifles returned, sharp and rhythmic. The platoon, scattered but unbroken, answered the invisible assault with fire of its own. Each shot was an act of defiance, not for victory, but for existence. The smell of burning fuel filled the air. An ammunition crate ignited, sending sparks raining across the hill. Porter ducked instinctively, shielding the radio. The antenna snapped halfway, the connection severed. For a second, he wanted to throw the useless machine into the mud, but then the static flared again. He froze. The sound wasn't just interference this time. It was a voice, faint but distinct, pushing through the chaos like a whisper carried on wind. "Allied units, hold, hold." The word repeated, fading in and out. Porter pressed the headset tighter to his ear, desperate to capture it before it vanished again. "Say again," he shouted, but the radio was already dissolving back into noise. He turned toward Morgan, his voice breaking through the din. "Sir," they said. But Morgan already knew. He had heard it too, a single word buried in static, carried across miles of war and indifference, a word that meant everything and nothing all at once. The shelling eased for a brief, impossible moment, leaving only the crackle of fire and the sound of men breathing. The fog returned, thick and suffocating, swallowing the flames until they flickered like dying stars. Morgan exhaled slowly, the taste of ash heavy in his throat. Around him, the men shifted, eyes wide and unblinking, waiting for the next sound, the next strike. Porter kept his hand on the radio, as if afraid it would fall silent forever. Through the static, faint and ghost-like, one word echoed again, softer, this time, almost like memory. He heard one word through the static: hold. Silence had become their companion, not the peaceful kind that invited reflection, but the heavy, suffocating quiet that followed too much noise. After the shelling stopped, the hill felt hollow, as if the world itself had gone deaf. Smoke clung to the ground, curling through trenches that were no longer straight lines, but broken veins carved into blackened earth. The once white snow was gone, replaced by layers of soot and mud that swallowed everything it touched. Days began to lose their shape. The sun no longer rose or set in a way that could be measured. Gray light became their only constant, a permanent dawn that never turned into day. The men counted time by the number of shells they had left, the number of men still breathing. Food was gone. The last cans had been opened 2 days ago, their contents shared evenly without ceremony. Now they chewed frozen breadcrumbs and melted snow, pretending it was enough. Hunger gnawed quietly, but it was the silence that hurt more. They stopped speaking unless absolutely necessary. Words wasted energy, and besides, language had started to fail them. Gestures became their communication. A nod for readiness, a raised hand for caution, a brief tap on the shoulder to show one was still alive. Fear had its own vocabulary, the tightening of eyes, the way hands trembled when reloading. Exhaustion, too, spoke clearly, in the slow drag of boots and the hollow stare that came from too many sleepless nights. Lieutenant Morgan could feel the weight of each minute pressing down on him. He moved among his men like a ghost, his own voice reduced to whispers. His journal had become his only confidant, though he no longer wrote plans, just fragments, memories, names. He listed them each night, the living and the lost, as if speaking them silently might keep them anchored to the earth. He no longer looked at the map. The paper had torn down the middle, the ink nearly erased. It no longer mattered where Hill 306 was on a chart. It existed only in their endurance. Private Daniel Reese lay half-conscious in a shallow pit, his leg bound tightly in Irving's improvised tourniquet. The pain came in waves that blurred his vision. He no longer cried out. He simply clenched his jaw and waited for it to pass. Doc Irving stayed beside him whenever he could, dividing his time between the wounded and the living. His eyes were red from smoke, his hands raw from cold and overuse. He had no medicine left, only willpower, and somehow that seemed enough to keep a few hearts beating. Corporal Porter still sat by the radio, though it no longer made a sound. The batteries were dead, the circuits burnt out from overuse. Yet every morning, he checked the wires, cleaned the dials, and placed the headset back on his ears. It wasn't communication anymore, it was ritual. The faint hiss of silence gave him something to focus on, a rhythm to measure against the madness. Sometimes, he thought he heard voices in it. Other times, just wind. Sergeant Halley had grown quieter with each passing day. The lines in his face deepened, carved by wind and worry. He moved through the trenches, offering nods instead of orders. The men followed without question, not because of rank, but because he was still moving, and movement was hope. Technical Sergeant O'Donnell had turned the hill itself into a machine of survival. He reinforced what little remained of the barriers, stacking debris, salvaging shell fragments for cover. Every act of repair was a form of defiance, proof that they still intended to exist. His hands bled freely, but he didn't seem to notice. 19 of the original 37 still stood guard, their silhouettes blending into the fog. The rest lay in makeshift shelters, too weak to rise or too far gone to be helped. The air was thick with decay and smoke. The forest below remained silent, though every man knew the enemy was still there waiting, watching. The hill had become more than a position. It was a state of being. They no longer held it for strategy or orders. They held it because abandoning it would mean admitting they had been sent here to die for nothing. Pride had been burned away, replaced by a bond too deep to define survival through silence, through shared suffering. Hallucinations began to creep in as hunger worsened. Porter once swore he saw a light in the trees, blinking like a signal. Halley claimed he smelled coffee, real coffee, fresh and hot, drifting from the forest. Morgan didn't correct them. He knew the mind's tricks too well. Even he sometimes thought he heard distant laughter, faint and warm, like a memory of life before the war. Night and day merged into one endless shadow. The fog glowed faintly from unseen fires still burning in the valley. Every few hours, a distant explosion would echo from far away, reminding them that somewhere else, the war continued to move fast and loud, while they remained trapped in stillness. Morgan gathered what remained of his men at dusk. They crouched in a semicircle, their faces gaunt and expressionless. He didn't give a speech. There was nothing left to say. Instead, he passed around the final bullets, each man counting his own silently. The numbers were small, the meaning immense. When the faint light of morning returned, Morgan stood at the crest, scanning the fog. His hands shook, not from fear this time, but from weakness. He thought of the word that had come through the radio. Hold. It had become their prayer. They no longer knew who had spoken it, or whether it was meant for them at all, but it was enough. By then, even the wind seemed to have lost strength. The hill stood quiet, stripped bare, its defenders shadows of men who had once marched with purpose. Hunger had erased individuality. Only instinct remained. Then, just as the day began to fade again into its endless gray, a rifle cracked somewhere down the slope. One, then another, then silence again. The men looked to Morgan, their faces unreadable, their hands tightening around what ammunition remained. He nodded once, steady, resolute. By nightfall, only 19 rifles still fired. The sky had turned the color of ash when the second German advance began. It wasn't sudden this time, it built slowly, like a storm gathering its strength. The faint rumble of treads and boots carried through the wind. The men of Hill 306 could feel it long before they saw it. Every vibration beneath the frozen earth told them that the silence they had endured was ending, that the final test was coming. Lieutenant Morgan crouched near the ridge, scanning through his binoculars. The fog shifted enough for him to glimpse dark figures, disciplined, approaching in formation. The enemy had learned from their previous failures. This time, they came with method, not fury. The platoon, what little remained of it, braced in their craters, exhausted but alert. There were no speeches now, no rallying cries. Words had lost meaning. Only action mattered. Sergeant Henry Red Halley stood at Morgan's side, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his jaw clenched against the cold. He had been through too many battles to mistake what he was seeing. This wasn't an assault they could repel. It was one they would survive only by buying time. He glanced down the line, 19 men, most wounded, all starving, their ammunition nearly gone. Then he looked back at Morgan. The younger officer's face was set in grim calculation. But there was something in his eyes, the realization that even courage had limits. Halley broke the silence first. "They'll come hard on the right flank," he said, his voice steady despite the trembling air. "If they breach it, we're finished." Morgan didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth hung between them like the fog, heavy, undeniable. Halley nodded once, decision made. "I'll take the flank." Morgan looked at him sharply. "You can't hold it alone." Halley's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I'm not holding it. I'm covering you while you pull the rest back to this end, inner line." Morgan opened his mouth to argue, but Halley had already turned away, adjusting his rifle strap and checking the last of his ammunition. Leadership, Morgan realized, wasn't about authority anymore. It was about sacrifice, the quiet kind that asked for no permission. Halley moved through the trenches, stopping briefly by each man. He didn't speak, didn't announce his plan. He just placed a hand on shoulders, nodded once, and kept walking. They understood. Every gesture carried the weight of unspoken farewell. When he reached Porter, he paused. The radio operator looked up, eyes hollow from sleeplessness. "We'll hear you firing," Porter said softly. "We'll know." Halley only nodded, his gaze distant. The right flank was a shattered mess of debris and half-frozen mud. He slid into position, setting his rifle against a broken beam and lining up the field of fire. The cold bit deep, but he ignored it. The sounds below grew louder, now shouts in. German, the clatter of machinery, the unmistakable grind of determination. He took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and waited. When the first enemy silhouettes appeared through the smoke, Halley didn't hesitate. His rifle barked once, then again, each shot deliberate, unhurried. His discipline held even as return fire chewed up the ground around him. The platoon heard his weapon echo across the hill, steady, unrelenting. It was the sound of one man standing against inevitability. Morgan gave the order to fall back to the secondary line. The men moved reluctantly, dragging the wounded, carrying what ammunition they could. Each step away from the ridge felt like betrayal, but they obeyed. They knew that Halley's defiance was their chance to survive. The Germans pressed harder, their fire intensifying. Halley reloaded calmly, firing until his rifle ran dry, then switching to a sidearm. The explosions grew closer, shaking his position apart. Shrapnel tore through the air, slicing into the dirt beside him. He didn't flinch. He just kept firing, until the rhythm faltered, until silence finally claimed his position. When the guns quieted, Morgan felt it immediately, the absence of Halley's shots. He stared toward the right flank, where flames now licked at the frozen soil. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Porter lowered his rifle slowly, and Doc Irving closed his eyes. The remaining men moved under fire, crawling toward the collapsed ridge where Hallie had made his stand. They found him half buried in debris, his body still clutching his rifle. His face turned toward the enemy as if he had refused to look away. Even in death, there was no ceremony, no words. Morgan knelt beside him, brushing soot from his hair, then motioned for the men to dig. They worked silently, shoveling with helmets and bare hands, while shells burst in the distance. They buried him where he fell, no marker, no prayer, only the weight of shared silence. When the last bit of earth was pressed down, Morgan stood, his heart heavier than the sky above them. For a moment, the men gathered around the small mound of soil. In that fragile stillness, something unspoken passed between them, the understanding that rank, race, and command no longer mattered. In death, Hallie had erased every barrier the world had built between them. Doc Irving pressed his gloved hand against the ground, whispering something too quiet to catch. Porter looked up at the clouds, his eyes glistening. Even O'Donnell, the man who never flinched, removed his helmet and bowed his head. The wind howled through the torn landscape, scattering ash like dust from forgotten graves. Morgan turned toward the others. "Back to the line," he said softly. His voice carried more resolve than grief. The men obeyed without hesitation, moving like shadows through the fog. They had no food, almost no ammunition, and barely any strength left, but Hallie's sacrifice had given them something else. Purpose. The Germans did not advance again that afternoon. Perhaps they believed the hill already taken. Perhaps they were simply waiting for darkness to finish what daylight had begun. Either way, the lull felt endless. Morgan stood alone at the crest, looking down at the crude mound that marked the place where leadership had transcended title. The fog drifted low, curling around the ground like a shroud. The air smelled of smoke, frost, and finality. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded map, the one that had led them here, the one that had lied to them from the beginning. He unfolded it slowly, stared at the blurred ink, then folded it again. Some truths, he thought, were not found on paper. The first stars began to pierce through the haze as night fell. The men waited, rifles clutched tight, eyes fixed on the dark forest below. The wind carried distant echoes, maybe engines, maybe ghosts, and still, no relief came from headquarters. The snow began to fall again the morning the reinforcements arrived. It came down quietly, indifferent to the carnage beneath it, covering the burned soil and twisted metal with a layer of pale stillness. The world looked almost peaceful from a distance, the kind of silence that could fool a man into thinking the war had passed this place untouched. But when the first Allied trucks crested the ridge, the illusion broke. Hill 306 was no longer a hill. It was a grave. The earth had been torn apart and rearranged by fire until it resembled a scar, a blackened plateau studded with craters and the faint outlines of trenches. The bodies were half buried in frozen mud, their faces obscured by ash and snow. German helmets lay scattered like fallen moons across the field. Captain Raymond Harlow of the 29th Infantry Regiment was the first to step out of the lead vehicle. He lifted his binoculars and swept the scene slowly. "My God," he murmured. Around him, the rest of the column came to a halt. Medics, engineers, and supply clerks climbed down, their boots sinking into the charred soil. The smell of oil, smoke, and death hung so thick in the air that no one spoke for a long while. They began to count. 900 German bodies were found along the slopes, sprawled, burned, and frozen where the artillery had caught them in retreat. The precision of the bombardment suggested coordination from within the hill itself. But when they turned their attention to the defenders' line, what they discovered defied belief. 36 American soldiers, all dead. Most were still in position, rifles in hand, as though waiting for the next order. A few had been dragged together under makeshift coverings, the remnants of tarps and blankets, frozen stiff by the cold. Their faces bore no panic, only exhaustion and quiet defiance. The pattern of the battle told its own story. A disciplined defense, deliberate withdrawal, and finally, the call for fire on their own position. One man was found alive. Corporal James Porter was discovered near the center of the hill, slumped beside the shattered remains of a radio. His hands were burned and torn, his uniform blackened. The medics thought he was dead, until they saw the faint movement of his chest. They lifted him gently, his body light from starvation. His eyes opened for a moment clouded, unfocused, and then closed again. He didn't speak. He couldn't. They carried him to the trucks, wrapping him in blankets that could not erase the chill. Harlow examined the radio. Its casing cracked, its wiring fused together in twisted knots. One of the medics found the signal logbook, half buried in the mud. What remained of Porter's notes. The last entry, scrawled in trembling handwriting, read, "Fire on our position. Hill 306 will hold." The captain closed the book and handed it to a staff sergeant without a word. Over the next 2 days, engineers combed the hill, piecing together what had happened. They found fragments of flares, German weapons turned outward, and the remnants of a field hospital set up among the rubble. It became clear that the platoon had held far longer than any unit should have. They had delayed an entire German column, saved 2 nearby divisions from encirclement, and inflicted catastrophic losses, all without contact from command. Yet when the after-action reports began to circulate, the truth started to fade. The platoon's designation and administrative mix-up that had haunted them from the beginning now sealed their anonymity. Official records listed them as support engineers, 331st Provisional Unit. No mention of combat assignment, no notation of a defensive stand, no commendation. The word temporary appeared twice in the summary, as though to excuse their existence. Hill 306 was filed under secured position, minimal resistance. In the hospital at Cherbourg, Porter drifted in and out of consciousness. His body was healing, but his voice was gone. Whether from shock or injury, no one could tell. Doctors tried to coax words from him, asked him questions about the battle, about command, about how he had survived. He only stared through them, eyes fixed on something distant, a memory still burning behind the smoke. When he was finally able to write, his hand shook so badly the pen left scratches more than words. He wrote names Morgan, Halley, O'Donnell, Irving, Reese over and over again, as if refusing to let them vanish. The nurses thought it was delirium. They replaced his papers daily, not realizing he was trying to preserve the only record that mattered. Weeks later, an intelligence officer arrived to debrief him. Porter sat upright in bed, silent, eyes hollow. The officer asked questions, tactical, procedural, detached. Porter didn't answer. He just pointed toward the window, where snow was falling outside, blanketing the hospital yard. The officer waited a moment, then sighed and closed his notebook. "You're lucky to be alive," he said quietly. Porter turned his head slightly, the ghost of a smile on his face. Lucky wasn't the word. In March 1945, the official report on Hill 306 was filed with the Allied command. It contained no heroism, no mention of the stand, no acknowledgement of the impossible defense. The file was thin, a single page attached to a logistics summary. It read simply, "Hill 306 secured after prolonged enemy resistance. 1 survivor recovered, no further action required." The document was stamped, copied, and archived. Corporal James Porter's personal report, written days later in shaking handwriting, filled with names, times, and details of the final battle, was placed in the same file. It was never read beyond the first page. The war moved on, and Hill 306 became another coordinate on a forgotten map, erased by victory's paperwork. Porter stayed in the hospital for months, drifting between nightmares and silence. When the war ended, he was sent home, his service noted as non-combat engineering. No one asked what he had built. At night, he dreamed of static, the hiss of the radio, the sound that had become their lifeline. In that endless noise, he could still hear them. Morgan's steady calm, Halley's orders, Irving's quiet reassurance. They spoke to him not in words, but in the rhythm of endurance. Years later, when historians searched the archives for details of Hill 306, they found nothing but that same thin report, brittle and faded. No photographs, no commendations, no witness accounts. His report was filed and ignored. Time, like the fog that had once cloaked Hill 306, rolled forward and covered everything. The war ended, the soldiers went home, and the world rebuilt itself on the bones of the forgotten. Years became decades. The hill was reclaimed by nature, grass growing over craters, trees sprouting where trenches once ran. To anyone passing by, it looked like an ordinary slope in northern France, quiet and unremarkable. Beneath its soil, however, 36 Americans still rested, men listed as support engineers, buried in a cemetery that didn't bear their names. For nearly 50 years, the Battle of Hill 306 existed only as a footnote in military archives. The official report, one page, half legible, sat buried in a cabinet labeled Logistics Miscellaneous, 1944. No memorial, no ceremony, no mention in textbooks. It was as if those 37 men had never been there at all. That began to change in 1993, when a graduate researcher named Emily Rorke, studying wartime misclassifications, stumbled across a declassified box of field reports in the National Archives. Most of it was routine requisition lists, repair orders, supply routes. But near the bottom, she found a packet sealed in brittle wax paper, stamped Provisional Unit 331, Do Not Index. Inside were handwritten pages, faded, smudged, and water-stained. At first, she thought they were notes from a logistics officer. But then she saw the names, 37 of them, written in two distinct handwritings. One matched the military registry of Lieutenant Cole Morgan. The other, shaky and uneven, belonged to Corporal James Porter. Rorke spent the night reading by lamplight. The words were uneven, emotional, raw fragments of a story too impossible to have been fiction. Descriptions of defiance, the call for artillery on their own position, and the silence that followed. And in the margins, one sentence, written over and over. We were not support. We held the line. The deeper she dug, the clearer the truth became. The platoon had not been engineers. They had been a mixed-race infantry detachment, an experimental group reassigned by clerical error, then abandoned when their coordinates went missing in a communication breakdown. Their temporary status had erased them from the combat registry before the battle had even begun. Within weeks, Rorke brought her findings to the Department of Defense. The reaction was bureaucratic caution. Officials confirmed the existence of the report but hesitated to classify it as a combat action. The documents had been incomplete, they said, unverified. They promised review, a word that meant delay. But truth, once uncovered, has a way of persisting. Rorke contacted families' names traced through census records, enlistment rosters, and letters long since faded. In Detroit, she found the grandchildren of Sergeant Henry Halley, who had grown up believing their grandfather was a mechanic killed in a transport accident. In Georgia, she located the descendants of Doc Samuel Irving, a man whose wartime medical file listed non-combatant reallocation. And in Baltimore, she met an aging woman named Ruth Porter, James Porter's sister, who still kept his last letter in a glass frame. When Rorke showed her the documents, Ruth read them in silence. Her hands trembled and tears welled behind her glasses. They called him an engineer, she whispered, but he was a soldier. The revelation spread slowly, then widely. Military historians confirmed the accounts through cross-referenced German war diaries, which detailed an unexpected and unusually fierce defense that stalled an entire armored division for 2 days in December 1944. The German records even mentioned the red flare, a signal from the enemy before the artillery fell upon their own position. News outlets ran the story briefly, calling it the Forgotten Stand. Letters poured in from the flare, families who had never known their relatives' fate. The Army issued a quiet correction in its historical database. Hill 306, Northern France Allied defensive action by elements of 331st Provisional Infantry, December 1944. No one publicly admitted the earlier error, but the change was there a small digital line rewriting half a century of silence. In 1995, a ceremony was held at Arlington National Cemetery. It was modest, fewer than 100 attendees, but among them were descendants of nearly every man from the platoon. Emily Rourke stood beside the podium as the chaplain read the newly inscribed names. She had fought for 2 years to ensure they were carved into stone, not just typed into a database. When the cloth covering the memorial was lifted, the crowd went quiet. The granite slab bore 37 names, etched deep and clean. Beneath them, a simple inscription read, "The 37 Hill, 306 they held." Reporters described the scene in brief paragraphs. The military called it a long overdue acknowledgement, but for the families, it was something sacred, a moment where grief and pride finally stood side by side. They left flowers, photos, and letters, written to men they had never met but somehow knew. At the edge of the gathering, Ruth Porter placed her brother's framed letter at the base of the stone. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "He tried to tell them." As the crowd dispersed, the sun dipped low, glinting off the polished surface of the memorial. The carved names caught the light: Morgan, Halley, Irving, O'Donnell, Reese, Porter, each letter gleaming for a brief moment before shadow claimed it again. Emily Rourke stayed until the last family had gone. She traced her fingers across the names and whispered the words written in Porter's notes. "We were not support. We held the line." The wind rose gently, rustling through the nearby trees, a soft echo of voices carried from long. For the first time, the story of Hill 306 had a place in history, though it had come too late for the men who had earned it. Justice, she realized, was never swift, but it was stubborn. A name once buried in archives, now engraved in stone. The years that followed the rediscovery of Hill 306 were slow, deliberate, and filled with the kind of reckoning that history rarely affords. The story, once unearthed, began to ripple outward, first through military channels, then across newsrooms, classrooms, and finally the quiet halls of government, where acknowledgement moved at a glacial pace. But time, as it had once buried their names, now began to uncover them again. In 1998, more than half a century after the last shot was fired on that frozen ridge, the United States Army formally convened a review board to assess the actions of the 331st Provisional Infantry. It was a process wrapped in bureaucracy and caution, but the truth proved unshakable. Testimony from German field reports, corroborating maps, and the rediscovered journals of Lieutenant Cole Morgan left no room for ambiguity. What those men had done on Hill 306 was not an accident of circumstance. It was valor of the highest order. The recommendation came swiftly, once the facts were undeniable. The 37 of Hill 306 were to receive the Distinguished Service Cross posthumously, and Lieutenant Morgan the Medal of Honor. There was debate. Of course, some argued too much time had passed, that symbolic gestures could not rewrite history. But others insisted that justice delayed was still justice pursued. One senator called it an obligation of memory. The ceremony was held on a gray April morning in Washington, D.C. The air was cool, the sky overcast weather that seemed to belong to their story. Rows of empty chairs represented those who could not attend, filled instead by descendants clutching faded photographs and folded letters. On the stage, a single flag from the era, torn but preserved, hung beside the podium. Its edges were singed from fire. Its cloth still smelled faintly of earth. An aging Corporal James Porter sat in the front row, his hands trembling around a cane carved from oak. His hair was white now, his eyes pale, but the steadiness in them was unchanged. For 50 years he had carried silence inside him, a burden built of memory and loss. When the Secretary of the Army presented the folded flag and read the names of the fallen, Porter rose slowly to his feet. Applause filled the space, soft at first, then thunderous. He stood quietly through it all, his gaze fixed not on the crowd but on the banner above the stage, where their unit's forgotten number was finally displayed. Reporters asked him later what he felt in that moment. Porter only said, "They would have laughed. They never fought for medals." And he was right. Those men had not held the hill for glory. They had held it for each other, for the idea that courage did not wear a color, and for a faith that equality could be proved not in speeches, but in sacrifice. Their story was no longer about the lost, it had become a testament to what unity could endure when the world itself fractured. A year later, the French government built a small memorial on the actual hill, now overgrown with grass and wild poppies. The locals called it La Colline des 37, the Hill of the 37. The soil still bore the faint scars of shell craters, softened by time but never erased. At its center stood a simple bronze statue, a soldier rising from the earth, rifle lowered, gaze lifted toward a flag half torn by wind. Beneath it, a plaque read, "They held a hill not for glory, but for equality." Visitors came in quiet numbers, students, veterans, descendants. Some left medals, others flowers. A few just stood in silence, letting the wind carry the echoes that still seemed to hum faintly through the grass. In the autumn of 2001, Porter returned to France for the last time. The journey had taken nearly everything from his frail body, but he insisted on it. He arrived at the memorial in a wheelchair, escorted by his granddaughter, who had grown up on his stories or what little he could bear to tell. As she wheeled him closer, he reached out and touched the bronze figure's base. His hand lingered there, trembling, tracing the etched names one by one. The air smelled of rain and soil, the same as it had that winter long ago. Porter closed his eyes, and in the silence he could almost hear them again. The voices of Morgan, Halley, Irving, O'Donnell, and Reese, calling across the fog, steady and certain. The static of a broken radio, the whisper of a single word, hold. Tears welled in his eyes as he whispered back, "We did." He stayed there for a long time, until the clouds began to break and light spilled across the valley. The hills rolled gently under a pale sun, and the wind carried the sound of church bells from a distant village. The war was long over, but the ground still remembered. When Porter passed away the following spring, his ashes were scattered quietly over Hill 306 at his request. There was no grand announcement, no cameras, no speeches, just his granddaughter, a folded flag, and the endless hum of wind moving through grass that once had burned. Decades later, tourists still visit the hill. Some come with history books, others stumble upon it by chance. Few know the full story, but all feel something when they stand there. A weight, a reverence, the unspoken presence of 37 men who proved that heroism isn't erased by silence. As the seasons change, the memorial endures. The flag above it flutters in the shifting wind, tattered but unbroken, much like the men it honors. They were forgotten by history, remembered by conscience. Some stories don't ask for applause, they ask to be remembered. If their courage still echoes in your heart, make sure their voices are never silenced again. Share their stand, keep their memory alive. And tell me, if you had been on Hill 306, would you have held the line or walked away?